It's the autumn of 1888, and a series of brutal murders in the East End of London has lit a flame that is about to strike to the heart of the British establishment and send shockwaves throughout the civilized world. Not unlike today, the City of London was Britain's financial powerhouse and reflected the supreme confidence of the age. Yet, right at its doorstep lay the district of Whitechapel, a sordid, crime-ridden quarter consumed in vice, violence, and drunkenness, where 76,000 Londoners lived close to the breadline. Somewhere amongst them, one man was committing murders more savage than had ever been seen before. He became known as Jack the Ripper.
It was a period where a lot of people were frightened. There was a genuine fear that there was going to be a revolution. The East End came to be the focus for all of that anxiety, all of that social anxiety. Jack the Ripper came along at just the right time, in just the right place. And so Jack the Ripper did penetrate the consciousness of the people in a way that an ordinary murderer hadn't done in the past and would never do again.
It is the night of the 30th of September. The Whitechapel murderer has already killed twice. Tonight he would strike again, bringing a third horrifying death to the streets of London.
To have such a high level of crime, so many murders in literally a few weeks, it really did cause a huge widespread panic throughout not just the East End but the West End too. I mean, women would not go out after dark in the West End, and those who were forced to go out in the East End, we've actually got reports of them actually carrying guns and knives to protect themselves.
There was even more to come that same desolate night. But where did it all start, and what's left there today? Richard Jones has been walking these streets for over 20 years, first as a tour guide, then writer and broadcaster, and knows every inch of this area. He's researched official police archives as well as newspapers from the time, and spoken to the people who've known this area all their lives.
We think he died in Coney Hatch. Coney Hatch?
He'll take us through the streets as they are today and uncover the real story behind the legend of Jack the Ripper. He's going to retrace Jack the Ripper's exact route on the night of the double murder, taking us over the very same streets the Ripper used as they still exist today.
Jack the Ripper's third murder is one of the most dramatic of all because it's the only one in which he was very nearly caught, and it's the only one in which he was seen in the act by a witness. I'm going to show you where these dramatic events took place, and our route begins here at Aldgate East Tube Station. To get to the site, turn right out of the station entrance and proceed down Commercial Road for about a quarter of a mile to Henrique Street, where you will turn right. In 1888, Whitechapel was a Victorian slum. Drunkenness, thievery and prostitution would have been everywhere.
Violence was very common because with all the drink available 24 hours a day, you can imagine people by the early hours of the morning might be very drunk indeed.
Street crime, petty thievery, I mean, there were several streets known as the blackest of the black streets, and policemen wouldn't go down those streets unless they were in groups of 4. That's how rough these little streets were for street robbery.
People lived crammed together in miserable circumstances, in absolutely dire poverty. All arches damp and dripping, and there was sort of straw on the floor and lots of horse droppings, all horses everywhere.
There's no sanitation, there's just off the main highways and byways you've got loads of alleyways and courts with people just throwing out their sewage and their rubbish. I mean, the stench must have been awful in the East End.
Well, there were 80,000 prostitutes on the streets of London. Whitechapel alone had become a serious problem. Home to 40,000 Jewish immigrants, Whitechapel was on the brink. It had become a hotbed of deprivation and crime, and produced the world's most notorious murderer. The police decided decisive action had to be taken, and took to the streets in force.
By the end of September 1888, the intensification of the police activity in the streets of Whitechapel had seen a dramatic downturn in the crime rate. There were newspaper reports that a dreadful quiet has descended onto the East End of London, and people began to wonder if the murders had come to an end. But on the last day of September, Jack the Ripper was to prove them horrifyingly wrong by murdering twice in less than an hour.
There was something different about this murder that would set it apart from the others and turn the 30th of September into a night Londoners would never forget.
Here we are, turning right into Henrique Street, but in 1888 this was Berner Street. The name has been changed to shake off the street's shocking history. Indeed, you can still see the painted out sign of Berner Street behind the new one. At 12:45 on the morning of the 30th of September 1888, Israel Schwartz was walking where I am now when he saw a man attacking a woman in the gateway of Dutfield Yard, which used to stand here siding onto the Polish and Jewish Working Men's Socialist Club. What stands here today is a school. Now children play on the exact spot where Jack the Ripper murdered his third victim.
Israel Schwartz turned into Berner Street and he was walking just a short way behind another man. And up ahead was a woman standing in the gateway of a socialist club. And he saw this man approach the woman. They exchanged words. Then there was an altercation. He was violent with the woman. He threw her to the ground. Israel Schwartz crossed the road and was going on. He subsequently identified the body of Elizabeth Stride. So he probably saw the murderer.
On that evening, Israel Schwartz thought he was witnessing a domestic dispute, so he crossed over the road and went home. But we know he actually saw Jack the Ripper in the act of murder, because only 15 minutes later, Louis Diemschutz came down Berner Street and turned his pony and cart into Dutfield Yard.
As he did so, the horse suddenly reared up with alarm and pulled away to the right. Something had disturbed it. Diemschutz climbed down to investigate and saw what he at first took to be a bundle lying in the centre of the yard.
Because we know that the horse shied, there's always a possibility that it sensed there was someone hiding behind the gate, perhaps, because the gates were open and there possibly would have been room for a man behind it, because Louis Diemschutz, after seeing the body there, thought it might be his wife. He was drunk, so he went in to check to make sure she was in there, at which time, if the murderer was still there, he could have easily have got away at that time.
Diemschutz struck a match to gain a better view, but in that brief second's light, Diemschutz saw was the body of a woman.
Now, had Diemschutz acted differently at that stage, the chances are Jack the Ripper would have been caught almost instantly, because the possibility is the Ripper was hiding here in Dutfield Yard when Diemschutz struck that match. Had he raised the alarm there and then, the police would have come running to the scene and the Ripper would have been taken.
If Louis Diemschutz raised the alarm and shouted out and tried to call as many people from the club next door as he did, if the murderer was there, it probably would have been very hard for him to get away without being caught, because Dutfield Yard was a dead end.
The woman's name was Elizabeth Stride, and her throat had been slashed clear back to the spine.
Some historians call her Lucky Liz because she only had her throat cut. There was no anatomical mutilation.
What seems apparent here is this is an interrupted Ripper murder. He's murdered Elizabeth Stride. He's about to commence the mutilations when the cart comes around the corner and disturbs him. So he jumps back into the shadows, and it's that sudden movement that startles the pony, causing it to shy to the left. Diemschutz is distracted. He's looking, he's investigating, and this gives the Ripper ample opportunity to step out of the shadows and move off in another direction. The Ripper had narrowly escaped, but the murder of Elizabeth Stride had not satisfied him. It had merely given him a taste for blood. And he went off into the night, angry, perhaps even a little excited, like a wild animal on the hunt for another victim, and within 45 minutes, he'd found one. From eyewitness reports, we were able to follow part of the route he took that night to his second murder. We'll track the Ripper's route from Berner Street to his next murder on Mitre Square. It's 1 a.m, September the 30th, 1888. Jack the Ripper has just murdered his third victim, Elizabeth Stride. Her body lies not a quarter of a mile away on Berner Street to my left. He's now on the run from his first murder, and on the hunt for his second victim of the night, and we're going to track him every step of the way. Our route begins here at Aldgate Tube Station. From the station entrance, turn right and proceed down Aldgate High Street, passing St. Botolph's Church on the right. Earlier on that fateful evening, Catherine Eddowes, a local prostitute, had been released from police custody for drunkenness. Her last known words to the desk sergeant as she left the station were, "Good night, old cock," she called, and went off into the night. We're now walking along Aldgate High Street, passing St Botolph's Church. In 1888, this was reputedly known as Prostitute Island, on account of the fact the prostitutes used to circle it looking for clients. It is possible that the Ripper, on the run from Berners Street, may have met Catherine Eddowes here, and the two of them then headed across Duke's Place, just as we are about to do now.
The Met actually sort of estimated that there were over 1,200 prostitutes of a very low class actually working in Whitechapel.
I wouldn't have thought that Jack the Ripper was necessarily targeting prostitutes at all. He may have been, we have no idea, but we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, so we have no real idea of what his motives would have been. I think it's more likely that he was interested specifically in targeting women and just trying to destroy women.
Having picked up Catherine Eddowes on the steps of St Botolph's, the Ripper lured his new victim towards the city's eastern fringe. But they made a detour on the way.
We know they stopped to talk because at approximately 1:35 a.m, a positive identification was made by one of three men who were leaving an Imperial Club that stood here on Duke's Place. They noticed a man and a woman talking with one another at this corner of St James's Passage and Mitre Square. As they passed, Levy observed to Harris, "I don't like going home by myself when I see those characters about," and they crossed the road in disgust. But Joseph Lavender was trailing a short distance behind the other two and took little more notice.
It's entirely possible that Joseph Lavender did see the Ripper, but he only got a very brief glance at the man that he saw and really didn't pay very much attention at all, and consistently said afterwards that he would not be in a position to identify the man if confronted with him.
Lavender didn't see the woman's face as she had her back to him, but he later identified Catherine Eddowes' clothing as that worn by the woman. He also gave the police a description of the man.
She was in the company of a man described as dark and swarthy, a foreigner.
Almost immediately after being spotted, the Ripper would have walked with Catherine Eddowes the short distance through St James's Passage into Mitre Square, just as we're doing now. We can be certain of this time frame because within 10 minutes of their being seen, Catherine Eddowes had been savagely slaughtered. If you look into the square from its east end, you'll see a flower bed on the west side. On a sunny day, workers often sit on the benches with their sandwiches at lunchtime. Few, if any of them, are aware that they sit next to the very spot where the murder took place. Many of the buildings here have changed, but you can still picture how the square would have looked. Over there was the warehouse of Keeley and Tong. And here are the original cobblestones over which P.C. Watkins, the constable who discovered the body, would have walked. At 1:45 in the morning, P.C. Watkins of the City Police walked his beat here into Mitre Square. The only noise he heard was the sound of his own footsteps. He'd walked this way 15 minutes previous and found the square to be quite deserted. Little now seemed to have changed as he shone his lantern into the square's dark recesses. But when the beam fell upon the spot in the square's south corner, it illuminated a horrific sight: the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes. He would later state, "I have been in the force for a long while, but I never saw such a sight. The body had been ripped open like a pig in the market." If the killer had been denied his satisfaction of mutilating the body of Elizabeth Stride, his appetite had been more than satisfied on the body of the unfortunate Catherine Eddowes. She lay on her back here, her head turned towards the left shoulder.
The injuries that Catherine sustained were really horrific in Mitre Square. She had her throat cut from left to right back to the spinal column. The murderer then ripped her up to the breastbone, disemboweled her, took away her kidney. He then placed her intestines over the shoulder. But not only that, to her body he actually disemboweled her, of course, which happened to most of the victims, but it was her facial injuries which were sort of really notorious, because he cut off the section of her nose, he partially severed her ear, He slashed her face continuously and then also had V-shaped triangular flaps underneath her eyes, just there.
Her blood would have been washed away from the very cobblestones under my feet. These flowers unintentionally provide a fitting memorial to poor Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's fourth victim. But the events of this long night of terror were not over yet, because on this night, Jack the Ripper left behind a clue. And we're now going to go through this passageway and make our way to the site where that clue was discovered.
There's 3 exits from Mitre Square. 2 of them, St James's Passage and Church Passage, would have been the most viable ways to get through. But if you're going from there to Middlesex Street or Galston Street, going in that direction, there would have been a lot of small streets in between.
September the 30th, 1888, 1:45 a.m. Jack the Ripper has just murdered his second victim of the night in Mitre Square behind me, and he is fleeing through this very passage, Mitre Passage EC3. We know his escape route this night because after this murder he left behind his only clue, and we're now going to follow his route through the City of London to the doorway where that clue was discovered. I'm now turning right out of Mitre Passage onto Creechurch Lane, and I'm about to cross Duke's Place and Houndsditch, just as the Ripper most likely did as he fled from Mitre Square. It's amazing that Jack the Ripper escaped at all, because at the exact moment when Catherine Eddowes was being murdered in Mitre Square, these streets were swarming with police officers on his trail because of the earlier murder of Elizabeth Stride over in Berners Street.
There were several police in the area, but obviously it was in the city, and we know that there were a couple of police officers sort of hanging around Houndsditch who were the first police officers to sort of be alerted to it. It's a case of possibly just luck that he managed to get from A to B without bumping into a police officer.
I've just crossed Houndsditch into Stony Lane, and I'm following the most likely route the Ripper took while fleeing from Mitre Square. The City Police, in hot pursuit of the killer, immediately set up a perimeter blocking every entrance and alleyway into this area. But in fairness to the police, the murderer was greatly aided by the layout of these streets.
My men formed a circle around the spot where one of the murderers took place, guarding. They thought every entrance and approach, and within a few minutes they found 50 people inside the lines. They had come in through 2 passageways which my men could not find, and then these people never locked their doors, and the murderer has only to lift the latch at the nearest house and walk out through it and out the back way.
He could have gone down those various streets, probably perhaps not seen anybody. They would have been very quiet until he came out onto Middlesex Street, which would have taken him onto Galston Street.
The Ripper had so many escape options. Over here, White Kennet Street. Over here, Artisan Street. Over here, Gravel Lane, and a myriad of alleyways running off of each of these places. The likelihood is, though, that he headed along Gravel Lane into the East End of London. Inspector Henry Moore of the Metropolitan Police's H Division had explained how the killer's seemingly miraculous ability to escape from the scenes of his crime was in fact aided by the Warren-like complexity of these Whitechapel streets and alleyways, the layout of which remains largely unchanged today.
Although the previous murders had taken place on Metropolitan Police territory, the City of London Police were already active in the hunt for the killer. Major Henry Smith, the acting City Police Commissioner, had given instructions that extra plainclothes detectives were to patrol the city's eastern fringes. But the Ripper was walking between them, undetected.
He could have gone down those various streets, probably perhaps not seen anybody. They would have been very quiet until he came out onto Middlesex Street, which would have taken him onto Galston Street.
Here we are on Middlesex Street, formerly Petticoat Lane, and the Ripper again has several choices, yet he opts to go straight across into New Galston Street, continuing his beeline into the East End of London, going to ground in the area that he knew best. I've now arrived on Galston Street, and over here is Wentworth Model Dwellings, dating back to 1886. This photograph shows it in the 1890s. I'm standing across from the large building that dominates the background of that photograph. The picture shows what was going to happen at 6 a.m. on the 30th of September 1888. The Petticoat Lane Market, which would bring thousands of Gentile buyers into the area to purchase from stalls largely run by Jewish tradesmen. The Petticoat Lane Market still trades every Sunday just over there on Middlesex Street. Some things in Goulston Street haven't changed at all. For example, at the end of the street up here is Tubby Isaac's Jellied Eel stall, which has been serving jellied eels to the local populace since Jack the Ripper's time. Let's go and have a look at it. Well, here we are at Tubby Isaac's at the end of Goulston Street, and I'm going to ask the big question. Are jellied eels still popular today?
Not really. Got a lot of people here now.
When did they start serving here then?
Yeah, 1992.
It was in the dawn of the 30th of September that a police officer would walk down this street, past this very corner, to the place where he would find the only two real clues of the case. Clues that might tell us who Jack the Ripper really was.
We know that Jack the Ripper would have been covered in Catherine Eddowes' blood as he fled from Mitre Square. He slipped out of sight into this very doorway here on Goulston Street. At 2:55 in the morning, PC Alfred Long turned into Goulston Street and discovered the piece of apron in this very doorway where the Ripper had discarded it.
We know from the rather repellent blood splashes and splatterings that were all over the place that the blood would have emptied from the victim, so he would have had blood on his hands and possibly on some part of his clothing.
Had he stopped in the streets and wiped his hands and wiped the blade of his knife, that could have aroused suspicion. He needed privacy, and it just so happened this was a recessed doorway where the lights were extinguished at 11 p.m. at night, giving him the perfect opportunity to duck into the alleyway and then use the apron to wipe the blood from his hands, wipe the blood from his knife, and then drop the apron, step out into the streets and disappear into the night. But the doorway contained something else, for scrawled in chalk on the wall above the apron was a message which read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
Jews was spelt J-U-W-E-S, which has been the cause of endless speculation in the conspiracy theories about Jack the Ripper.
But the meaning was quite clear. It was racist graffiti above a genuine Jack the Ripper clue. When the Metropolitan Police saw it, they were anxious to destroy the message. But the problem for them was the city police and their detectives had soon crossed the boundary. And what the Met saw as possible incitement to racial violence, they saw as an important clue and wished to photograph it. "Are you mad?" said the Met. "That means waiting till it gets light. When it gets light, these streets will be sprawling with people. We'll lose control with anti-Jewish rioting." The city police countered and said, "Well, just rub out the word Jews." "No," said the Met, "the meaning will still be clear." And this argument was still going on at 5:30 in the morning when Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, arrived at the scene. This was his territory. His word was final. He took one look at it and said, "Wait no longer. That message goes, and it goes now." So at 5:30, with his most controversial order of all, Sir Charles Warren had the message erased from the wall before it could even be photographed.
He elected to have the words rubbed out, chiefly because he didn't think that there was any way that they would be able to mask those words from the general public, who would soon be thronging that area for the famous Petticoat Lane Market.
The wall is still here today. Today, ironically, it is the Happy Days Fish and Chip restaurant, and few of its patrons are aware of the evil that took place on this very spot as they order their mouth-watering portions of fish and chips.
I love a bag of chips, actually.
Well, we're actually going into the doorway now, and it is the takeaway counter for the Happy Days Fish and Chip shop. And do people still come in here and ask you about Jack the Ripper?
Most people, when they come in here, they still don't have a clue that Jack the Ripper just left a mark here years ago, obviously.
So they just come in for their fish and chips?
That's it, that's what they do.
Well, there's my
and we
cue.
do a brilliant fish and chips. The actual clue was on that wall just there. Obviously there was a wall here, but the clue was in that corner, and this is where the writing was.
Well, there's a good cue. I'll have cod and chips to go, please.
By all means, you can have as many as you like.
The wall has been repainted many times since then, with nothing to remember that long ago morning when the head of the Metropolitan Police ordered the destruction of what some have seen as a very important clue to the identity of Jack the Ripper.
With the break of day on the 30th of September, The Whitechapel murderer had succeeded in killing 2 women right under the noses of 2 police forces, and had left their senior officers baffled, bickering, and totally frustrated. Although the Whitechapel murders were never solved, one thing is certain: the legend of Jack the Ripper refuses to die, and interest in him increases with every year that passes. And with so many dedicated researchers still on his trail, the day may yet come when the Ripper is finally named.
After 4 murders, Jack the Ripper had escaped yet again, but he wasn't finished yet. For within 6 weeks, within a few short steps of this place, he would murder once more, this time the foulest and most disturbing of his killings. And I'll take you to the site of Jack the Ripper's final and bloodiest murder.